Hi, welcome back to How to Be Smarter Than Your Teacher. I'm Mr. Green. Probably not your teacher. Well, if you're watching this, pretty likely you are a student at the great St. Anselm's Abbey in Washington, D.C., which if you are not a student here, think about it. We're discussing two documents today that most teachers teach after the Constitution because they came after the Constitution in chronological order, and I'm teaching before the Constitution because I think they really illustrate these sort of deep philosophical concerns that everybody in the writing of the Constitution and in its adoption process had. And they're two sort of different ways of looking at a very similar problem. So if you go back to our discussion on the Declaration of Independence, we recall that the fundamental problem of government is that it's coercive. And the Declaration of Independence is saying anytime, your rights, your inalienable rights are being, or you're not getting your rights from the government, or the government's not respecting your rights that you have inalienable, you have this right to rebel. And that's a wild statement, because how do you get around that? I mean, at some point, the government is going to coerce you to doing things you don't want to do. And it goes back to a real problem that goes deep in English thought, in English political thought, going back to Hobbes, really. Hobbes argues something very different. And you can read Thomas Hobbes, 16th century British philosopher, writes during the Civil War, and he says, the goal of government is to keep you out of war. That's really the goal of government. And we can talk all we want about all sorts of nice and peace and happy things, but really government's here to stop war. That if there was a war, which there would be without government, you would die. No matter how strong and amazing you think you are, nobody's going to survive. And certainly there's no guarantee of survival. And that goes to another problem, which is inherent in the nature of government, is that people fight governments anyway, knowing that there's going to be a war. Hobbes lived during the Civil War. So English political thought, especially what might thought of as like kind of classically conservative, which has nothing to do with conservative today necessarily. We think about like Edmund Burke or David Hume or even Adam Smith. They worry about sentiment. How will I trust in and believe in a government? Where will I care about my government? And once we get to 1786 and 87, after there have been revolutions or revolts against this government, the question is, how are people going to trust government, knowing that government's occasionally going to do things you don't like? And there are two very distinct sort of ways of looking at that. And they're contained in Brutus number 1 by an anonymous author, and then Federalist 10, which is written by James Madison. Now, those documents are written after the Constitution is not adopted, but written and during its adoption process. Brutus is going to argue against the Constitution. Federalist 10 will be an argument for it. We want to outline both of them, and we want to think really hard about the arguments they make. And Brutus is going to argue very much that if you're going to have sentiment, it's got to be on a smaller scale. That the real problem here in our system is that it's already too big. And so if we go to the very beginning of Brutus number 1, and you can get this in anywhere you want, he sort of has concerns, and we should sort of start with them. He says, it's about 4 paragraphs down, remember when people part with power once, they can seldom never resume it except by force. Many instances can be reduced in which the people have voluntarily increased the powers of their rulers, but few, if any, which rulers have willingly abridged their authority. In other words, a national government is giving way too much power by the people, and the people won't get it back. And essentially, the reverse is the problem. If the people can't get their power back, well, maybe they're going to have a revolt. Maybe they're going to not abide by the not war part of government, which is really, the problem of government. And Brutus goes on a few pages later, and he writes this thing about large republics. So the problem in his mind is that the people will give their power to a large republic, a more centralized government. If we're dealing with the Articles of Confederation, the problem is, remember, both that neither the states nor the federal government have much power. And the Constitution solves it by giving the federal government a lot of power. Brutus is sort of saying, we could go the other way. We could give local governments more power. And he says, in republic sentiments and interests of people should be similar. If this is not the case, it will be a constant clash of opinions. The representatives of one part will be striving against the representatives of those of another. This will retard the operations of government and prevent such conclusions as will promote the public good. In other words, the problem, if you think about it, in the articles, most teachers will tell you, and this is why I'm smarter than them, and you are going to be smarter than them too, is that it makes the central government too weak. But as we saw, even local governments, they can't declare war. They don't have much power. They can't get together and join in small groups. Everything has to go through a central government. And given that there's a 9 out of 13 vote on anything the central government does, nobody's powerful enough, including local government. So why not just empower local governments? That would be the idea here. And he also says, so not only will there not be sentiment amongst the people of this giant nation with all different topographies and all different regions, but it's going to tend towards corruption. And he says the trust committed to executive officers in a country of the extent of the United States, and it's like the power given to those people, must be of various magnitude. And the command of the troops and the navy of the republic and the appointment of officers and the pardoning of offenses and collecting all the public revenues and public expenditures must be lodged and exercised in every state. And you're putting all those things in the hands of a few. And the very nature of that, according to Brutus, means is that very, very powerful people who have a lot of desire for power, a lot of hubris, and maybe not the interests of everybody in mind, are going to capture the republic. So that's an argument against the Constitution. It would be an argument for more localism, which is still a conundrum inside the U.S. How much power should be apportioned to the federal government? How much should it be local? In Federalist number 10, Madison comes at it from a different point of view. And he's going to argue that the same problem, the problem of people's sentiment and the problem of representation and the problem of corruption, are actually best solved by a very large republic. And he starts by stating, if you read Federalist 10, he says right away, we're not interested in some absolutely democratic thing. And you'll see when we get to the Constitution's not particularly, it's not a democracy like the Greeks had. This is a republic in which people eventually have power. And he says, the instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases of popular governments have ever perished. And what he's saying, we're not going to have the Athenian-style democracy where everyone's will is immediately executed. He says, in fact, it would be unwarrantable to contend that they have effectually obviated the danger on the side. He's saying, even though we've tried in this document to sort of curb democracy, he says, understand that problem is still there. So he's being incredibly honest. We cannot get over the problem of a public that is unreasonable. That it's still an issue. But he then goes on to try and explain the problem as he sees it. And the problem is what he calls faction. And faction means, and we're going to read what he says, when some common impulse or passion of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. In other words, when people organize themselves essentially against the other citizens in their country, then you have what he calls faction. Faction's the real danger, that different factions will fight each other. And as we're going to see, he has one more thing that you got to understand. He says, as long as the reason of man continues to be fallible. So we have all these people. They have all their interests. They tend to go towards faction. And he says, because our own reason is really not that strong. We're really not that smart. And he says, he is at liberty to exercise it. Different opinions will be formed. So as long as we're allowed to have opinions, there will be different opinions. And as long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and passions will have reciprocal influence on each other. The former will be the objects of the latter to which the latter will attach themselves. In other words, whatever my passions are, my reason is going to attach to my passions. So if I really, really love living along the seashore, I will think that building houses along the seashore is a good idea. I can't disaggregate my interests. I can't disaggregate my passions from my ideas, which reinforces the previous paragraph. If it's true that people tend towards faction, and faction is sort of defined as when I define myself against another set of citizenry, what he's also saying is that you will never actually think that you're engaged in faction, because you'll actually think that the best interest of everybody is your interest. So Madison takes a very dim view of the interests of the people. He thinks that no matter what, people can't be trusted at any given moment. And so he says this is unavoidable. For example, differences in property. The rich tend to think that whatever's good for the rich is good. The poor tend to think what's good for the poor is good. Well, they're not going to be able to actually see around that. That's just, they won't see around it because your interests are mated to your intellect. So he says, well, we have some checks and balances here. We're going to introduce checks and balances. For one, no man should be allowed to judge his own cause because his interests would certainly bias his judgment. So that should be from, the poorest person in the country all the way up to the president. The president doesn't get to be a judge of the president, which is interesting because right now, the Supreme Court has said that the president could pardon himself, which is an interesting thought. It does seem to go against an idea here. But the big thing that he says is because we're going to have faction, and this is paragraph 11, he says, to secure the public good and the private rights against the danger of such a faction at the times to preserve the spirit and form of popular government is the great object to which our inquiry is directed. So he's saying we're trying to deal with that. How do we create a government that preserves the rights of the people to have thoughts and ideas and opinions, but also preserve them from faction? And this is really a part of his answer, and we're going to get in the Constitution because the Constitution is going to deal with this issue. He says, the smaller the society, the fewer probably the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer distinct parties and interests, the more frequently a majority will be found of the same party. So Brutus is saying it's good if there's a majority, right? And they're going to get along and they're going to have sentiment together. But Madison says no. In fact, the more frequently a majority will be found of the same party and the smaller number of individuals composing a majority, the smaller the compass with which they are placed, the more easily they can start and execute their plans of oppression. In other words, having a small government is actually more oppressive. And Madison's going to argue that if you have a greater variety of parties and a greater variety of interests, you'll make it less probable the majority of the whole will have common motive to invalidate the rights of other citizens. So as we go into our Constitution, understand the goal of the Constitution is going to be, and we'll start discussing it next time, to separate out all these different groups. That's why we have 3 branches of government. That's why power is shared from the federal government to the state governments. Our very fractious Constitution is an example of this sort of despair of thinking. That's what we said last time, right? Peace comes to despair. And what Madison's saying is if you want to have peace, we don't want to have faction. And faction would be successful, and the people in that one faction would be like, oh, wow, we have really succeeded. And the whole goal of the Constitution is for people not to succeed, for any one group to not actually be successful in achieving all their aims. But disappointment and the acceptance of disappointment is at the core of our Constitution. So with that happy thought, I will leave you, and I hope you have a great day.